Hello class, this is chapter 7, staffing. Kind of wanted to start talking about staffing fit and begin within that topic with organizational culture, because I see organizational culture as one of the keys to staffing fit. So part of the challenge is, how do you measure organizational culture and how do you convey it? It's a pretty difficult thing to get your arms around. How do you understand and convey or communicate an organization's culture? I think maybe we should start by defining what organizational culture is. It's the shared set of beliefs, expectations, values, and norms that influence the ways people in an organization think and act. So this would be quite important. Let's not think about organizations at the moment. Let's think about you as a job applicant. Certainly, if you are applying to a company and they're showing some interest in you, it would be highly valuable activity to pick up as much information as possible about the organizational culture. And that is a little bit tricky because they are going to try to convey, most organizations will try to convey a positive portrayal of their culture, and they may convey information they want you to know, but you've got to dig deeper and find out what are the aspects of organizational culture that they're not sharing with you, or maybe to some extent they're not even aware of. If they've worked there so long, they've lost touch of how their organizational culture differs from many other companies. So certainly as an applicant, we want to be kind of keen observers of organizational culture, and I've even done some work with trying to come up with instruments, questionnaire instruments that applicants could ask organizational insiders, managers that they might be working for, or other knowledgeable insiders working for the organization, to fill out, so that the applicant can compare their preferences regarding organizational culture with the preferences that are important to them with the actual culture as seen by the organizational insiders. So this matching process is pretty important. So it's a big fit factor, a predictor of fit is organizational culture. So I think that the more we can tell applicants about our organizational culture and what it's like to work in a company, the better. That will allow them to make some more informed decisions about whether they should accept a job in the company, whether they'll be a fit. Next, I would like to shift gears to what Cassio calls choosing the right predictor. So he's using the term predictor in the sense that we use these measures of applicants during the staffing process to try to predict outcomes. What's the outcome that we care about? Certainly job performance is usually the main predictor that we're thinking of. So in other words, which of these predictors will be good at assessing an applicant's future job performance if they are hired? So a predictor would be things like selection interviews, tests that we put applicants through, work samples, even reference checks would be a predictor. So I think it's kind of a different way of talking about selection, but if you ponder it for a moment, it makes a lot of sense. We're trying to choose the best set of predictors to use during the selection process to put applicants through these so that we hire people who will indeed be good job performers. And it's a very challenging task. It's difficult to predict future behavior, and it is difficult for a variety of reasons, just human nature. People change, people try to portray their best image when they go through the interview process. So it's a difficult task, so we need to know as much as we can about this. So some of the points Cassio brings up in terms of choosing the right predictor are, it's going to depend on the nature of the job. So certainly for white-collar jobs, some of the predictors might be slightly different than those for blue-collar jobs, with overlaps, of course. So validity of the predictor is another point that he brings up. So validity is just simply the predictive power, how good a predictor of job performance or absenteeism or counterproductive behavior, whatever we're trying to predict, how good a predictor is that selection method. And there have been hundreds of studies and some good meta-analyses, these studies that pool together a lot of research findings. We know a lot about what are good predictors and not so good predictors, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Cost of the predictor. Certainly, how expensive a certain selection method will be factors into our decision about whether to use it or not. So, some of the best predictors are job knowledge test, cognitive ability test, work samples, and structured interviews. So job knowledge test. Define the domain of job knowledge and then test applicants over that knowledge. Those tend to be pretty good predictors. Work samples. So certainly asking an applicant to perform the work or work a task that's quite similar to what they would do on the job tends to be a pretty good predictor of future job performance. I think work samples are time consuming and therefore somewhat expensive in the sense of time is money. They tend to be underutilized, but please think carefully as a manager or a boss or someone involved in the selection process about trying to think of work samples, tasks that would be good indicants of an applicant's future performance. Problem is we can ask questions. So, how good are you at using this particular computer software? How organized are you? How good are you at this particular aspect of job performance? Talking and doing are two different things. So you have some applicants that are very persuasive talkers, but not very good doers, not very good job performers. And work samples can help us sort out people that truly are good from those who either think they're good but really aren't, or who falsify how good they are. Cognitive ability tests. Some students disagree with this, so it can be somewhat controversial, but they're very inexpensive compared to a lot of other selection methods, and they are good predictors of job performance. I think where a lot of my students object is they say, look, I've seen a lot of smart people fail because they either don't work hard or they have personality issues. That is true, but certainly if somebody's not very bright, that's going to be a challenge on many jobs. And so the fact that pretty extensive research has shown that cognitive ability is an extremely good predictor of job performance doesn't undermine the fact that personality can come into play, that motivation can come into play. We're not minimizing those factors. We're just saying research indicates cognitive ability tests are a good predictor of job performance, and certainly, since they're not very expensive, something that companies should consider utilizing as a selection tool. And then also I mentioned structured interviews. Initially, I was a little more pessimistic about the interviews as a selection tool, and even structured interviews, which are more valid than the unstructured interviews. But research suggests that a carefully constructed, carefully executed structured interview can be a pretty good predictor of job performance. So in a few moments I'll share some ways to increase the validity of the interview. And certainly, since the interview is the most commonly used selection method, we want to know some tricks and some techniques for increasing its predictive power. All right, I'd like to share with you my recommended approach to selection, and it's kind of a structured, rational approach. So if you would take a moment to think about it, it might be helpful in the future when you are seeking to fill a position. I think it'll make your job searches and your selection of employees much more effective, much more satisfying, because the success rate will be higher. So here's step one of the structured, rational approach. Determine the needed knowledge, skills, and abilities. So this goes back to job analysis. Does it have to be an intense, rigorous, super time-prolonged job analysis? Well, if it's a key enough position or an occupation that you have numerous people that you hire into, you might want to do that. But at least there's a few methods you could use to do relatively quick job analysis that would help you identify the important KSAOs, knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics, because that is what we want to home in on in the selection process. We can ask all kinds of interview questions we can find on the internet or the web. We can ask all kinds of pet questions or use all kinds of crazy techniques that we've heard about in selection, but I think really you're going to be on more solid legal ground and better at picking somebody who's a fit for the position if you understand the position and what knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics are necessary for success in that position. So identify those and then focus hard on the key knowledge, skills, and abilities. Out of those, maybe we can't measure everything in the selection process. Which of those are most important? And take each one of those most important knowledge, skills, or abilities and think about what the best measures or selection methods would be for measuring that. In some cases it will be an interview question. In others it might be a work sample where you ask applicants to do something. In other cases it might be a reference check. So that is the process. It's a structured, rational approach that will be much more useful to you. I think a lot of times using multiple methods can be helpful too. So if I were conducting a selection process, I would want to measure those most important knowledge, skills, and abilities very thoroughly. And in some cases that may take more than one method. So it might be an interview question and a work sample. It might be some kind of job knowledge test and a reference question that we ask to applicants' references. So usually multiple methods will shed more light than one single method. So in some instances you might want to consider using complementary methods. I'd like to shift over to what Cascio refers to as the logic of selection. I think we could spend a little time on this, not too much. A couple concepts that he mentions in there, wanted to make sure we're clear. We don't necessarily need to belabor these, but they are useful for even managers who are not HR managers to be aware, because you can use these to critique your selection process. So reliability and validity are the two concepts I'll talk briefly about. Reliability comes in a couple different forms. So, for example, one form is test-retest reliability. That would be where if we have applicants try a particular test at time one, and we brought in the same set of applicants to do the exact same selection method, the same test at a later point in time, time two, scores for those individuals should not be significantly different from time 1 to 2. Think about that for a moment. What would be the issue if their scores varied a lot? Certainly you can have an applicant who just didn't try very hard the first time, or was sick at time 1 and was feeling better or trying harder at time 2, but aside from that, those unique instances, if scores fluctuate a lot between time 1 and 2, so different times that the same test is administered, that's problematic, right? That's low test-retest reliability. There may be an issue with the test. If you think about it, that's one reason that, I don't know if you ever took the SAT or ACT more than once. Now again, unless you just didn't try one of those times or were ill one of those times, for me, and I think for others, scores didn't fluctuate a lot. Little bit, but significantly, no. One reason for that is because the SAT and ACT are so long, it increases reliability. So there's a variety of ways to increase reliability, but test-retest reliability is one thing to consider. Secondly, probably even more important to practicing managers would be inter-rater reliability. So this would be where different people rating the same performance or behavior, do their ratings tend to agree or do they differ? So in the selection arena, maybe one of the easiest ways to think about it, if we did a panel interview or a group interview of one applicant, if we have a valid selection process, we've got trained raters, good interview questions, a scoring guide, which I'll talk about in a minute, our ratings, we've all listened to the same applicant answer the same questions, our ratings of the applicant's answers or performance should not vary much. If we do have a lot of variance in our ratings, that's low inter-rater reliability. That indicates some kind of problem, so we need to look into our process. So both of those things can be important to be aware of the reliability and validity. Validity is just how powerful is the selection method in terms of predicting, in this case, job performance. Is it a valid predictor of future job performance or not? That's kind of the ultimate test of a selection method. And we talked earlier about some of the most valid predictors, the work samples, cognitive ability tests, and so forth. I would like to encourage you to seek a second opinion on selection tools unless you have a pretty robust, experienced HR department or have a organization that's been through these processes numerous times and refined their processes with help from consultants or outside agencies. You might want to, particularly before adopting some unusual selection method or before adopting a selection tool that has been marketed to you by a vendor or seller, might seek a second opinion. So a professor that knows a lot about these topics might be ideal, somebody who's done research on selection methods. These people might be able to, for free or a small fee, provide that second opinion. So before we seek surgery or invasive medical procedures, a lot of times we're advised, get a second opinion before you do something radical. So you might think about that with selection. Seems a little bit odd, but really not, because you can spend a lot of money on these selection methods, or you could actually use methods that result in illegal discrimination or problematic discrimination, or selection methods that just don't work very well. So consider seeking out somebody who can kind of read beyond the marketing provided by a vendor and ask the hard questions that need to be asked before a selection tool is adopted. All right, one of my key concepts I would like to mention in this chapter is the idea of being a suspicious hirer. So I tend to be feeling that there are a number of applicants who you don't actually want to hire because of their job performance won't be very good, and there may be applicants that tell you what you want to hear, or applicants that can just be a real problem if you do hire them. So really I want to go to great lengths to be a suspicious hirer. So as Cassio says, always verify key aspects of previous history. Right? Always verify key aspects of previous history. I think that's important. So, reason for that is you can become liable for negligent hiring. If you hire somebody who has had problems in the past or criminal offenses, for instance, and you hire them to come in and work with a vulnerable population, children, customers that might be more vulnerable, any customer, and you can be liable. So in other words, if you should have known something about this person's prior history before you hired them, you failed to find that out, you hired them and they caused harm to one of your employees, a customer or a client, you can be liable for negligent hiring. So really kind of need to do your homework on this if to avoid this, because you don't want somebody committing a crime in the course of job duties, something you could have predicted if you would have dug deeper into that person's past. So how do you do this? Well, background checks are one way, and those are a little bit difficult. You can outsource this. This is one area that I probably would outsource. There's experts out there. There's firms that specialize in doing background checks, and those people, if you hire the right company, know what they're doing and know how to get this information. When I was in industry, I worked with a company called Equifax. I think there's other companies out there, and obviously it depends who the individual is for that company conducting the background checks. But if you get somebody that's diligent, motivated, good at that, they can uncover a lot of things that you can't. I think there's ways to get reference checks to be more effective, so I'd encourage you to look into that. So we all know it's hard to get former companies, people that, organizations that applicants worked for prior to talk to you. They tend not to want to talk to you at all or give you much information, but you can use release letters. You can have these legal documents that applicants sign that protect these former managers or organizations from lawsuits related to releasing information on that applicant. So these documents can make the former companies that an applicant worked for feel more free to share information, and you want them to feel free to share information. You need that information about prior job performance or prior problem behavior to come out so that you don't hire a problem employee. This can be quite problematic, and I think it's a problem in the United States at least, because we tend to not share information organization to organization, and so we pass ineffective employees back and forth to each other because we're not sharing. So you do have to be careful as a company insider what you say, but there are ways to get more information about former employees who've applied to work at your company. And we need to be very smart about how to do that. We need as much information as we can. Excuse me. One of my favorite techniques is to check unsolicited references. So we know when people apply for a job, they tend to give a list of references. Who do we put on those lists? People we got along with, people that thought we performed well. It'd be nice to talk to some people who had a more balanced perspective on an applicant's performance. So a lot of times when I'm calling those references on the list supplied by the applicant, I will ask those people for others who might be able to give insight on the applicant's performance. Who else worked with the applicant frequently? A lot of times the people on the list will give you other names. A lot of times you can reach those other people and ask about the applicant for a more balanced picture. So that might be one technique you stick in your toolbox. I'd like to go back to the selection measures briefly, excuse me, and give you some tips related to the interview first of all. So we all know we tend to do a lot of interviewing in the United States. Why not know how to do it effectively? First tip for success is structure. So these sloppy interviews where people just sit down and kind of wing it, and slang for ask whatever comes to mind, those aren't very effective. We already talked about it, the rational, structured approach where we base the selection methods on the job content. So that's step one. Do the job analysis. Look at the most important knowledge, skills, and abilities, and for any of those that interview questions might be appropriate measures, structure out the questions. What exactly are we going to ask? Are we going to ask a situational question where we paint a situation, ask the applicant how they would handle it? Are we going to ask a behavioral question where we paint a scenario that an applicant should have encountered and ask them how they have handled that in the past? Those tend to be probably the best predictors of future job performance among the types of interview questions, these behavior description interview questions. And then using a scoring guide increases the validity. So what would a good answer to that question look like? A mediocre answer and a low scoring answer, an ineffective answer look like for each of the questions that we come up with? Coming up with a scoring guide, high, medium, and low scoring answers. You could either actually list out good, mediocre, and poor answers that an applicant might actually give to that question, or you can just list indicators or criteria that would indicate what would be included in a good answer, what would be some characteristics you would see in a mediocre answer, and what would be the types of things that would make an answer lower scoring. So either of those two alternatives. Why bother? Scoring guides tend to reduce bias. They increase that inter-rater reliability we're talking about, so they tend to increase the validity. They're a little bit time consuming, add a little bit of time to the preparation process, but certainly seems to be advisable and worth the extra time. And then certainly listening. One of the classic mistakes that novice interviewers do is talking too much. Filling up the time, we want the applicant or interviewee to be doing by far the great bulk of talking. Yes, there is that part of the interview where we're answering questions. We ask the applicant, so what questions do you have for us? But aside from that section of the interview, we want the applicant to be doing a lot of talking and us to be doing a lot of listening. The more listening you can do, the more you learn about the applicant. I have had clinical psychologists that did work in the selection arena tell me that one of the keys was just having applicants talk. So That's a little outside of the structured interview, so I'm not sure I would recommend that. But the point of this person, this clinical psychologist that did a lot of selection for companies, was that you can learn a heck of a lot, some of it useful, some of it downright troubling if you just have applicants talk for an extended length of time. So, not sure I recommend that, but the point is well taken, that a lot of listening and not a whole lot of talking is usually preferable for most of the interview process. I think work samples, performance tests, knowledge tests tend to be good, so we certainly want to rely on those as we talked about earlier. I'd like to mention that a leaderless group discussion is a technique that has a lot of potential, so you might read up on that. Leaderless group discussion, you have applicants assemble in a group. Typically you give them a problem to solve and you observe them while they solve it, hopefully in a unobtrusive way where you kind of fly on the wall watching the performance. So this allows you to measure a number of factors: how people problem solve in a group setting, how they relate to others, how they listen to others, how they work with others in these situations. So keep that in mind. It's a little bit of an unusual tool, but I think it's a heck of a lot better than asking interview questions about things like, so tell me about how you work with others in a group setting. If possible, why not assemble people, applicants, in a group setting, give them a task and observe their performance. Cognitive ability tests we talked about earlier tend to be underutilized by a lot of companies. Take a look at the research on it if you are skeptical. So I would like to talk a little bit about personalities predictor. I would say be pretty careful with that. I think you could get burned. There's a lot of companies that market personality predictors, and those can be personality measures. If they're good ones, can be good for helping employees learn about each other and how to work more effectively. In the selection arena, I would be pretty wary of these personality measures. There is one potential exception: conscientiousness. That's one of the big 5 personality factors, they're called, and conscientiousness has proven to be a pretty good predictor of job performance for a lot of jobs. So in most jobs, being careful about what you do, being conscientious is an important thing. So you might consider that as a predictor. I might work with a consulting psychologist or a professor the first few times on that to figure out which jobs I would use it for, how to score it, which would be the best measure of it. But that would probably be the one exception to my feeling that you need to be pretty reticent or wary about most personality measures as a selection tool. Additionally, the research literature does indicate if you're picking people for international assignments, you might want to consider another big 5 personality factor. It's called openness to experience. But that's a pretty specialized application, selecting people for international assignments. So there again, assessment centers or working with consultants who specialize on selecting people for international assignments might be worthwhile. But again, just mention that openness to experience. Certainly you need to be an open-minded, open to new experiences if you're going to be a successful manager in another country. All right, Cassio provides some examples in the chapter, and he points out that we might want to consider making it a part of a manager's job to identify, develop, and retain high performers. So we're back to staffing in the organization, not selection so much, but mainstream staffing. Make it a part of the manager's job to identify, develop, and retain high performers. I think that's quite important. So certainly managers who don't do that are going to cost us a lot of money. We're going to lose some of the best people. We're going to have to go through the recruiting and selection process. We're going to lose some intellectual capital. So that makes a lot of sense to me. He says select individuals who fit key cultural values. That also makes a lot of sense. We talked about organizational culture. People who are not a good fit won't be as happy there, as effective there, maybe won't stay as long. So selecting individuals who fit those key cultural values would be important. Or at least ensure that our realistic job preview before we hire people into the company, that they have a chance to understand what our culture is about, so they can do some self-selection about whether they're a fit, or there's no surprises once they are selected into the culture. Cassio says, build a culture that appeals to those you want to hire and keep. Certainly that ties back to some of the things we've talked about, measuring what's happening in the work environment, measuring employee attitudes, thinking about the core dimensions and the aspects of the organization's psychosocial attributes or its psychological climate. Do we have the kind of culture and climate that people want to work in, that they can thrive in? So building a culture that appeals to the type of people that perform well and that we want to keep would be worthwhile. And then last, I'll conclude by saying, should we assess how our organizational culture is affecting different employee subgroups? We might want to consider doing that. So the culture that we have in the organization may be beneficial for some employees but not for others. So should we look at how that culture is perceived by and affects different subgroups? Women, minorities, our best performers, our least effective performers. That might be something that we could look into, or hire consultants or action researchers to come in and help us with, because you can get some eye-opening surprises sometimes when you start collecting this type of information. Typically, if you have a good, strong, healthy culture, there won't be a lot of big surprises, but anytime we can fine-tune how the work environment affects employees, that's probably worthwhile.